I think quite a common retort to the kind of work that we're doing is, okay, but which police are which institution of the police are you talking about? You have to be specific.
What I'm interested in thinking about is the way that we think about the makeup of the social through colonial modernity. And so this is why police is not just a thin blue line, but is the form of the world itself.
Hello, my name's Milena Lamb. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to Tia Trafford about their book, Everything is Police. Just a little bit about me, I guess, before we get started. I am a lecturer at the University of Law, London, and I'm the author of A Philosophical History of Police Power with Bloomsbury. I look at issues of police power and how police power relates to sovereignty and law, and thinking about this in the context of Western philosophy or the canon of Western philosophy, which has some interesting affinities with the book that we're going to be discussing today. Tia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Milena. So yeah, my name is Tia Trafford, like Milena said. So I'm currently reader in philosophy and design at University for the Creative Arts, which is based around the southeast in the UK. So we're going to discuss my new book, which is Everything is Police, which is trying to think about policing both in its kind of concrete instantiation, but also in the most abstract way possible. So thinking about what is policing, what is it coming from, where is the kind of desire to police and be policed come from, and building upon quite a lot of conversations that are becoming more prevalent in the past few years, where people are trying to think about things like the racial violence within policing, and often thinking about that in terms of tracing the origins of police to plantation or colonial origins. And I'm trying to build upon that and follow that trajectory a little bit further. I think that work is incredibly important, but it doesn't necessarily go far enough in explaining what Frank Wilderson, for example, talks about in terms of the universality of Black policing, and Rinaldo Walcott, who talks about the way in which police violence is like a normal and an almost mundane part of Black life.
Yeah, that's really interesting because we have sort of landed on similar approaches, I think, to police power from slightly different angles, but independently of each other. So it's really great to be able to be in conversation with you, and our books are very much in conversation without knowing it when I was writing mine and when you were writing yours, presumably. But just as kind of a further introduction, I wonder, you kind of mentioned the limits perhaps of some of the other critical writings on police that we've seen proliferate in recent years. But maybe you could just say a little bit about what prompted you to write this particular book in the first place.
Yeah. So I wrote this book called Empire at Home, which came out during the pandemic. I think maybe like 2021, something like that. And that was thinking about whether or not we could usefully apply the idea of the internal colony to Britain, and particularly contemporary Britain since the sort of 60s, 70s, and thinking about the way in which Britain might be understood not as encapsulated by its borders, but as this kind of continuing like colonial project which goes far beyond those borders, and in which then we can kind of think about internal colonization not necessarily bounded by the island shores, but in terms of a set of kind of logics and things like that could be deployed in various ways across Britain as colony through time and space and things like that. And in that process, obviously, a lot of that was thinking about policing and the police and techniques that had been developed in colonial policing and then brought into the kind of heartland of British policing, and thinking about how that worked out in terms of like counterinsurgency and stuff like that. So I'd been doing that work, and there's a bit of a sort of philosophical inflection in that work, in the sense that I was looking at Britain as this kind of unstable category almost, which has to kind of constantly recuperate itself and reproduce itself. But I wanted to return to some more philosophical questions. And in the same moment, there's a couple of things. Like, one is like I was reading work by writers like Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton and David Marriott and Rinaldo Walcott. And this was pushing me, it was challenging, I think, some of the limitations of that previous work, which was much more sociologically embedded and challenging me to really think about what was happening at a more kind of abstract level. And then at the same time, we're going through a pandemic in which policing, and particularly kind of interpersonal policing, was just absolutely rife. So all of the neighborhood chats, and as much as we wanted to like set up like mutual aid groups and like helping people with like shopping and mobility issues and all this kind of stuff, and lots of good things happening, but even in those spaces, policing became rife. Like all of the kind of snitch hotlines and things. Like my neighbor was out exercising for more than their allotted hour. And it's like, what is this? Like, where is this desire coming from? There's this real compulsion to police ourselves, to police one another. And like very quickly that becomes ensconced in this racialized discourse, like immediately, but also in this requirement that we must continuously like self-police. So thinking about these things together pushed me towards thinking about policing in a more abstract way, but not abstract in the sense that it is kind of divorced from the concrete by any means, but thinking about these two things together.
Yeah, so I was going to ask because in my work, I think about the relationship between police power and sovereignty specifically. So if sovereignty is the power to kill and it not be considered a crime, which is kind of how certain jurisprudence thinkers would conceptualize it, along with political theory thinkers. I'm wondering what the relationship for you is between policing and the police, because for me, the police have the ability, and frequently use that ability to kill with impunity, right? And I wonder what happens when we subsume the police under a larger banner of policing as such.
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. And I think that I'm not thinking about it in exactly the same way. I maybe need to translate these things a little bit more. Let me put it in slightly different terms. And I think that the translation probably works because also when you're thinking about sovereignty, you're thinking often about this like space of exception. If we're thinking about like Schmidt and Agamben and things like that, right? So let's think about things like the police as the thin blue line, right? So this is the overriding myth. It's almost like rooted in Hobbesian kind of myth. Like society will like collapse into this like regressive state of nature unless we have the police can constantly like reproducing the border of the social, right? So protecting us from our external and internal omnipresent potential dissolution. There's this kind of idea of this like mythological function of the thin blue lines inscribed into the nature of the world in order to function. Part of that myth that I think is really important that I want to hold on to is that this is necessarily an incomplete project. And that incompleteness comes into the foreground through a kind of insecurity and instability that necessitates the police, right? What I'm interested in thinking about is I think we might need to internalize the thin blue line, I guess, into the way that we think about the makeup of the social through colonial modernity. And so this is why I'll get to this idea that police is not just the thin blue line, but is the form of the world itself. So actually, the boundary between order and disorder is not one which is grounded before the police turn up. And then the police simply are kind of keeping the boundary in place, right? The boundary between like violence at the extremity, including, so for example, quite often how we think about this, even in relatively decent, like kind of leftist understandings of colonialism, is that like colonialism was this like horrendous violence that's happening somewhere else, and there's like civil society like back home, and that's like calm and nice and reasonable and things like that, right? What I'm trying to suggest is that distinction, which I understand through the language of this idea of the breach, using like Wynter and Fanon and Hartman and writers like this. This distinction is something which is constituted through colonial modernity, in which then the world produced through that breach has to be constantly sutured, and it's an impossible kind of task to do so, right? So I don't know if this is exactly answering, but essentially where you get to is following really apt phrase from Jared Sexton's work, which is the idea that the police are the avant-garde of white supremacy. That may well be a misquote, but it's something like that.
So then you're saying that the institution of the police is simply a kind of embodiment of this more abstract worlding, as you might call it.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're thinking about like something like abstract policing, I guess, is precisely needed to manage this kind of unstable world, which is produced through colonial modernity. And it's like, part of the question is, how do we turn a frontier into a world? How do you kind of internalize the violence necessary to constitute this world? Effectively, how do you make slavery into social form? This is the way that, like, Tapji Garba is writing about this. And part of the argument is to say that, well, policing then becomes constitutive, so that in the way that we normalize and internalize and legalize anti-Black violence, in order that it is the ongoing condition for white life and freedom and property and things like that. And part of that is coming out what I was saying earlier about trying to move beyond, or like push further, let's say, along the trajectory that we see with a lot of writers recently thinking about origins. And it's loads of good work in that. And I'm not criticizing that work. It's really important to think through how those systems and technologies and techniques become embedded. I want to, rather than just trace the origins of the police to the plantation, I want to stay with the plantation. I want to, like, Wynter talks about the way that the plantation concretizes, Sylvia Wynter concretizes new social forms that kind of reorganize the world and reorganize what it means to be human and different sort of genres of man, as she puts it. So I think this question of then, if that shifts and that becomes entrenched in the structure of what the world is and what we are, then I want to remain there and think with that. So this idea that, like, actually Sara-Maria Sorentino also writes about this, that something that was just really important, and I think she's thinking with Wynter here, is that we need to stay with slavery whilst thinking about why staying with slavery is an impossible task. So there's something of what I'm trying to do in this work is thinking about the violences of white worlding beyond things like hierarchy, beyond exploitation, and to think about these things at this level of kind of political ontology that congeals around this unstable kernel.
Yeah, I think that it comes through really brightly in the book, the limits of various quote unquote critical accounts of policing without you sort of having to spell them out or without you kind of going into loads of details about those accounts. I think your book really elegantly demonstrates the limits of those accounts without having to go into loads of details about those accounts. And I think that's something that's really great about it. But I do want to dig in here a bit more to what you think those limits are, because I can sense them in the book, but you haven't necessarily elaborated on them that much. And you sort of pointed towards there with what you were just saying about this idea of the colonial origins of the police. In my book as well, I speak about that account as being limited in the sense that, just kind of pointing to an origin that is in another time and another place doesn't really get you to the productive and what Sexton and Martineau called that the avant-garde of policing, right? It thinks it's explaining why police violence or acts of police violence in the present are meted out on certain people over and above others by reference to this kind of colonial origin. But it doesn't constitute an explanation for me because it's not actually explaining why these acts are repeatedly happening in the present. And I wondered if you could say anything on that.
Yeah, I think that your argument in your book is perfect, particularly around the colonial boomerang. And I'm almost tempted to just like get you to tell us that. But like, let me sum up what I'm taking from your argument as well, and you can tell me if it's wrong. I think that part of the problem with those, there's several problems. Part of the problem is that it exceptionalizes violence, like I was saying earlier, right? So this is where you push out that violence to the colony and then it returns, it boomerangs. And in the process, rather than understanding that that violence could be constitutive of the worlding, what you're doing is rather making it into this kind of paradox. Like actually, you've lost the ability to explain what's happening in that case. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe this is kind of moving towards questions around some of the thinkers that we're both thinking with that are like potentially slightly unusually thinking with in the UK, at least, or in my experience. And I think we've spoken about this previously in terms of like so Afro-pessimism. This is almost a term that has become a kind of bogeyman in the way that it's attracted so much incredible fervor and caricature. The story of how a book comes to be published is one that should probably be, for the most part, just lost to history. But I pitched this book to a different publisher at first, simply because I knew someone who was there. I'm very happy with where it ended up. But I got quite detailed comments on that initial pitch, and it was like I think there was a couple of chapters. It was a it was slightly different in the way that it was written up and stuff. As you know, these things kind of move. And the main comment was like, "This book is Afro-pessimist and therefore bad." Like that was that was. I mean, it was not spelled out quite so ridiculously, but like pretty much, right? And for a start, I think saying that this book is Afro-pessimist is just like a wild misinterpretation of what is happening. Because for a start, we're thinking about specifically the violences of white worlding, and Afro-pessimism is far, far wider and more interesting and invested in so many different things. Secondly, like what that does is it really congeals together a massive range of people who I think maybe in different contexts, maybe, and this was in a UK context, so perhaps it's different in the US. But thinking about the kinds of people who I'm thinking with, so people like Saidiya Hartman, who mentioned, and Sexton, Rinaldo Walcott. We talked about David Marriott and Wilderson, but also like Biko, Mandela Gray, Sylvia Wynter, Sara-Maria Sorentino, Tapji Garba. All these people. These people do not coalesce into like Afro-pessimism. There are people in there who may be avowedly Afro-pessimist. There are people who are critical of Afro-pessimism. Like Biko and Rinaldo, these writers are like working, orthogonally, I think, in many ways. Even Sexton is writing that paper about optimism and pessimism and thinking about these two things as kind of modalities. There's a real problem in the way that this form of thought is caricatured, is made into a kind of monolith. There's a multiplicity of things happening here, which I think are lost as a result. This is really interesting because what does it do to turn a form of thought into a bogeyman? It's effectively like a way of disciplining things. It's a way of like keeping things in check, pacifying things, recuperating certain things. And the reason why I think this kind of maybe relates better to your question is that I think what's the main thing within Afro-pessimism that people are concerned about, and it's the idea that we're thinking at the level of political ontology rather than at the level of like sociology or materialism or empirical data. But at the same time, we're talking about disciplines that trade in abstraction constantly. We're very happy to talk about power and domination and value and labor in the abstract, but we're not happy to talk about the abstract slave. And this is very interesting. If it is the case that Wilderson and Sexton, I think, possibly clearest here, although that in a sense you can read their work as extending Sylvia Wynter's work or taking it down a sort of specific direction, then this is necessary to think in the abstract in order to understand the sort of theological and political entrenching of racial slavery. And Lewis Gordon is really nice. He summarizes Winter's position on this as the idea that racial slavery is written as the theodicean grammar of the world. So the idea is that then racial slavery cannot be adequately articulated at the level of the empirical or the historical, because it becomes a condition around which those things coalesce. And of course, then, like, the slave, as we know through modernity, through these discourses like sociology and Marxism, becomes abstracted. It becomes this like abstract figure against which, things like freedom can be thought. It becomes like the conceptual armature through which we can articulate the world around us. So, like, obviously the idea of wage slavery is the obvious one, but in this period, the metaphorical slave becomes the figure of any possible subjugation, whilst the racial slave becomes increasingly kind of invisibilized. We're chastising Afro-pessimism for operating at the level of abstraction, but it seems to me, at least, to be absolutely necessary to think about the way that the human and the slave are articulated together across modernity. I've been reading Soren Mao's book recently, which is talking about things like mute compulsion and emergentism and the logic of these are all abstractions. And they're abstractions that actually, Mao would presumably disagree with this, but I think probably require us to have already thought about the role of the slave and the way that possession and domination figure kind of conceptually to make those models cohere.
Just as a side note, I gave a presentation when I was a PhD student at my university, and there was like a visiting, quite well-known Italian philosopher who was visiting from Italy, who was in the room, and I gave this presentation, and it was about actually Benjamin's critique of violence and the police. So I was just beginning to think about how I was going to conceptually deal with police in this kind of abstract way that I wanted to, right? And she was very critical of what I wrote. She did not like it at all. But I remember the main comment that she gave me was like, you shouldn't or you can't write a metaphysics of the police. And I thought
Wow.
that was,
Wow.
yeah, and I thought that was like a really interesting criticism because she just dismissed my whole project, right? Like, you can't write a metaphysics of the police. And then I sat there and I was like, but what if metaphysics is police? Maybe not
Nice.
like straight away, but you know, this is, I think, quite a common retort to the kind of work that we're doing is okay, but which police are you know, which institution of the police are you talking about? You have to be specific. And particularly when you're talking about anti blackness in the police, there is a sense in which the US police are frequently exceptionalized, or even the UK police are exceptionalized in the sense that people often say, oh, the UK police, you know, they don't have the same problems as the US police. And part of that stems from the fact that the US police originate in the slave patrols, which isn't the case for the UK police. I don't know if this is a response that you've had, but this is certainly something that I've come across at various places that I've presented my work. You know, you can't, essentially telling me you can't use the same analysis because of the institutional and geographical specificity of the US police that doesn't apply in the UK. And I wonder what your response to that. I mean, I think I know what your response to that might be, but whether you could say something about that.
Yeah. People would say that, you can't extrapolate anything from US centered articulations of blackness either. And again, like to return to the kind of Afro pessimist, this idea that what you're doing, if you are doing something at the level of political ontology, then what that means is that you're just like universalizing from a specific position, and that position is a kind of US position, and it might work there, but blah blah blah, it does not. And of course, like maybe there are like some understandings of ontology, I guess. I mean, we're kind of used to that like knee-jerk response to ontology a decade or two ago. I think things have moved quite considerably. Thinking about ontology and metaphysics in philosophy, sort of return of the real and all that sort of discourse. When was that? Like probably over a decade, but I can't remember. But particularly when it comes to things like race, I mean, you can see why we don't want to ontologize in the sense that that critique thinks or like at least objects to, because of course, like that is not what's happening in this work. Then the other thing is, of course, like UK exceptionalism is like a whole thing. So the idea that the UK can be closeted off effectively from everything else that went on, I mean, that is like written into the myth of like Britain and Britishness, isn't it? Wasn't it also like Enoch Powell who said, look, like the colonial project has failed and we actually risked everything by having contact in the colonies. We risked our very like Britishness, and he means this in the most sort of eugenicist sense. Because at the same time, he's talking about like, what we need to do is like reproduce good British stock, get back to like full health, all this kind of like all of these sort of like standard sort of eugenicist metaphors. So there's something about this idea of Britishness which is salvageable, even though it's done this thing where we risked like a kind of impurity in contact with others. That kind of like British exceptionalism is written into what it means to be Britain. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all to have that response. On the other hand, we are emphasizing abstraction so far in the conversation. The other thing that I'm doing in the book is like there's quite a lot of history in there. I mean, it's a short book and I'm not a historian, but I'm trying to root things in a context. This is very much something that where I hope at least to be kind of thinking with Wynter's approach. So I think this is incredibly important, if weird, to think history and philosophy together. We don't normally do this. Like social sciences and philosophy together is a little bit more normal, but like I'm sort of flip-flopping a little bit often between like, in chapter 1, thinking about Kant and thinking about Plantation Barbados. Well, I don't really talk about methodology, and I quite like the idea that maybe this is both slightly disorienting and but also simply in the form of reading in this interwoven way. It enacts the kind of methods that I'm interested in. I think it's really important to think the specific and the abstract together without collapsing them into one another. What's happening in this, in the avoidance of thinking abstraction, I think, is you end up in this idea that we need to reduce everything to the sociological or to empirical data. And then what comes of that is you end up writing in sort of transcendental norms without ever having the capacity to articulate them. You have this sort of genealogical reduction, possibly. It's impossible then to understand the kind of normative construction around those things. You don't have the explanatory framework. So Winter's really, really useful on this because what she's doing is showing us how there are codes that become entrenched in the world, and that through our kind of social practices and institutions and things like that become further and further kind of entrenched. We build upon these things and they're self-reproducing, become self-reproducing. So she talks about autopoiesis a lot. And there's a writer who's working in philosophy of biology called William Wimsatt, who's also in the background of my thinking here, who talks about the idea of generative entrenchment. And this is the idea that the more things that you build on top of systems, the more those things become entrenched. They seem as if they are necessary or natural. So I think thinking about things in the way that Winter does, requires a sort of level of specificity, which is really important, but not at the cost of abstraction. So thinking about this in terms of things like affect and stuff like that, where you're abstracting and then you end up with like an excess that you then explain as something which becomes key metaphysical focus or like the key that unlocks everything. So I think that there is something about, it's important to think about Britain and British policing. And there are unique things that are happening there, of course, and it's important to think about these things. I'm hoping that what's also kind of interesting about the route that this book takes is that we move from plantation Barbados, we move a little bit into the US, but also we move back through to thinking about the way that then what Britain does through sort of formal emancipation, and then through like colonization, decolonization very briefly, but then to think about sort of contemporary forms of policing through Britain, and also the continuation of unequal exchange and property systems of property and things like that. It's highlighting the way in which those things that are seemingly able to be exceptionalized are absolutely kind of forming the logics of how things work still.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice thing about the book is that back and forth that you were just talking about. I think it works really, really well in enacting the thing rather than describing the thing that you're going to do and then saying it, right? It sort of enacts it, which is really, really nice and really impressive as well. One thing that I was going to say also is when I, again, sorry to make it about my PhD, which it's absolutely not, but going back to the beginning of my PhD again, when I said to people I'm writing about philosophy and the police, the response was often, oh, okay, so you're writing about Foucault and or Rancière, was normally the response. And when I said, no, I'm writing about Hobbes and Hegel, you'd get some kind of rather odd looks. And I wanted to kind of ask you as well, obviously Kant figures quite heavily in the book as a figure that you're writing about and whose thought that you're writing about. And I wonder, how did you turn to Kant, firstly, to think these things through?
I mean, Kant's the archetypal like police philosopher who doesn't really talk about the police, just embodies the police. I'd done some work on Kant a long time ago, so I knew Kant. So it's partly a matter of familiarity. And because I was thinking about this idea of, thinking with Winter and thinking about, as she talks about moving through the genres of man, I was thinking about Kant. I mean, she doesn't talk about Kant really, which is interesting. I think this maybe because she's more concerned with thinking through the relation to the state. But this idea of like, well, what if we think about Kant in relation to 1492 in terms of what Winter's talking about this stuff? What would that mean? So thinking with this idea of Hilary Beckles, who's a historian writing about Barbados as the first black slave society. And I was thinking about this question. So how do you, if we think about this idea that, how do you turn a frontier into a world? How do we move from the sort of thin blue line to the world itself? How does slavery become social form? How does whiteness congeal? How do we make these distinctions between indentured servitude and plantation slavery? How does that work? How does that become formed into something like civil society, right? With law and institution and things like that. So thinking about what the slave codes were doing, reading beyond what they're explicitly doing to think about how this collective ratification of like white responsibility, so whiteness becoming a matter of collective possession and collective violence. Kant is answering not those questions clearly, but Kant is also thinking about how you turn a frontier into a world. There's a lot of stuff in the background of this book, I guess, and it's stuff that I will continue to work on and have been working on a bit since. Part of what I think Kant is doing is asking the question, well, if we are to come into contact with an other that could destabilize us, how do we make sure that we aren't completely dissolved? In less abstract terms, I guess it's like, if it's possible for people to become enslaved, how do we make sure that we as Europeans can never have been in that position, to make sure that we are free and that our freedom is certain? You can read Kant as asking very similar kinds of questions, right? And I think this becomes more obvious when we're thinking about the way that Kant deals with race and racism. But again, like, this is sort of reading between the lines a lot, and there's a lot of debate about Kant and race. There's some very good work, like Adler's work is excellent, I think, on this. But I would point towards Sean Capener's work on this, I think, is doing something a lot more interesting with Kant, where we're starting to see a reckoning with Kant that isn't just like, was Kant a racist? Because, yeah, obviously Kant was a racist, but that's not the interesting question. The interesting question, I think, is, given that Kant is effectively working within this environment and attempting to produce a theory of like the subject, what are the ramifications of this? And so for Kant, like, Black people can never be figured within kind of universal humanity because they are forever in a state of nature. This means that they will be a threat always. Kant at one point says that we'll see these people wiped out. We should not actively like commit genocide against them, but they will like sort of go by the wayside. So there's a kind of interesting determinism written into the progression of the world. In order that the world, comes to more fully express freedom and reason, we will inevitably see this happen. And later on in the book, when I'm talking about Kant and then Hegel, the argument there is essentially a very simple one. In order to make the theory cohere, then you require the presence of Black people, and you require the presence of essentially like a naturalization of racial slavery that you can't admit into your system. It's illegitimately transcendental, as Ronald Judy puts it. But you require that, but you also require that it is gone. So you're reliant on something that you necessarily need to eliminate. And therefore you have this idea of the progress of humanity, so the eventual like coming to fruition of the human, which is effectively the sort of white European writ large across the world. The cosmopolitan view of progress is one in which, as I put it, white destiny is both necessary and impossible. So yeah, I think these things are kind of, it's a speculative reading of Kant for sure. And I will expand on it more in other work, but I think other people are doing more interesting things with Kant. Kant is such a thorny topic as well. I really shouldn't have picked Kant, because like when you see people even like suggesting that Kant might have been racist on like Twitter and stuff, there is so much backlash. It's like, yeah, but it's nothing to do with his like entire system, and it was annexed. And then, well, did he change his mind about this? Because it looks like maybe he changed his mind. So there's a whole like loads of literature on this stuff. I don't really think this matters. I think what matters is the way in which the whole system actually depends on the idea that you can exteriorize race in the same moment that you need it for your system to work.
Yeah, definitely. So I just wanted to go back to something that you said about the threat always being there, the state of nature as threat kind of always being there as well, because this is something that I write about in my book as well, is this idea of the state of nature, which is not actually outside of the state, right? But it kind of exists in the heart of the state. And I wondered about how you see this and the relationship to criminalization. And what I mean by that is that you have this interesting bit, you're talking about the Barbados slave codes. And you say the Barbados slave codes attempted to enforce a distinction between violence towards whites prompted by transgressions against prohibitions in law and violence toward black slaves as gratuitous and without constraint. And I think that really encapsulates this idea about gratuitous violence, or what Frank Wilderson and Patrice Douglas call metaphysical violence, that is in a different register to simply the violence of the criminal justice system, let's say. But what I find frequently in, again, kind of the critical literature around police violence and anti-Blackness is the idea of the myth of Black criminality, right? So I'm taking that from Paul Gilroy, who has written on this and talks about this myth of Black criminality, right? This idea of criminality is attached to Black people, which then sort of justifies state violence against them because they're being configured as criminal, right? Regardless of whether they're actually breaking the law. There's a limit to that account because it presumes that, for me anyway, that the police are responding to criminality, even if that's just a kind of mythological criminality, right? Even if it's a criminality whereby, the person hasn't actually transgressed any laws, but it's still assuming that the police are responding to a perceived criminality rather than a gratuitous or metaphysical violence that kind of exists in a different register that perhaps doesn't conform to these distinctions between criminal and non-criminal. Does that make sense? I'm sorry if I'm waffling a bit.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think this is in part what I was trying to do in the first chapter when I'm looking at the slave codes, particularly in the way in which whiteness sort of congeals around policing, is I'm trying to explore that distinction that Wilderson and others are making between violence grounded in transgression and violence that is gratuitous. And I think, again, this is another place where this distinction is often mischaracterized, but thinking about it in terms of the myth of Black criminality is really useful, actually. And I actually think it's almost inarguable when you think about it. I kind of don't really get the disagreement with it in some ways. I do find a bit like some of the sort of disagreement with Wilderson just a bit perplexing. I start out that chapter describing quickly the murder of Azelle Rodney by the police in 2005. It's the London Met Police. And that was an absolutely vicious murder. As a hard stop, there was an attempted cover up of the camera data. Actually, I'm not sure if anyone got the camera data. The audio recordings were released a lot later. The witness testimonies didn't match the testimonies of the police officers involved. I think he was in the back of the car and he was shot like 8 times from like a meter away. It was absolutely vicious. And he was supposedly like reaching for a gun and, there was no gun, of course. And yeah, like the typical thing that we do in response to that is to say, well, let's think about whether or not he was deserving of this. It's hideous. It's obscene to think like this, to my mind. The subsequent discourse around these kinds of events always emphasizes guilt or lack of guilt and justice and justification. And this is normally coupled with like a load of kind of media reports around, in this case, being a dangerous gangster and things like that. And, a bunch of stereotypes. I think Gilroy is quite strong on the way in which the media representation of Blackness employs those stereotypes. And of course, Stuart Hall, thinking about like British cultural studies traditions around this kind of work. It's really important. But like you say, that entire way of thinking considers the actions of the police to be constrained and given credence through an institution like the state or a structure like the law or the legal justice system. And as I understand Wilderson's point, at least, the idea is that for Blackness, and this is how you started the question, wasn't it? If we're thinking about Blackness as kind of embodying the state of nature, like using that sort of discussion through Kant and other philosophers also, then the distinction just doesn't work. Like the distinction itself just breaks immediately. It doesn't make sense to talk about the criminal or the non-criminal for the state of nature. So making the myth of Black criminality the sort of central motif, what is that going to do? It's going to ultimately recuperate the idea that there is a criminal, non-criminal distinction, which essentially recuperates policing. It effectively is kind of getting things like the wrong way around. And the thing that really stands out to me in the case of Azelle Rodney is that his murderer, Anthony Long, when the audio is released, I think it's him or at least fellow officers can be heard saying sweet as he's executed in the back of this car. This is exactly the excessive, libidinal, gratuitous violence embodied in this moment that I think Wilderson is pointing us towards, and why it's so necessary.
That can't be explained via a notion of simply, black criminality.
Yeah, exactly.
Those theoretical tools simply can't comprehend, as you say, the gratuitousness and also the pleasure that's being expressed in comments, like you just said.
Yeah. It should be an utterly obscene pleasure, but it absolutely isn't. I think this is why actually it's important that Red, White and Black, one of Wilderson's books, is about film, and Sexton is also writing about film, thinking about art and film, and thinking about these things in terms of the libidinal, and thinking about pleasure, I think is incredibly important. This is not something that I think UK, we have like traditions of thinking through like psychoanalysis and things like that within UK academia, of course. But when it comes to thinking about policing, I'm not seeing that in the same way, at least.
I wondered if we could talk a bit about, because it is such a big theme in the book, about property, and specifically the way that you're departing from what might be called a racial capitalist account of policing and property. There's a really interesting departure that you make there, again, but without kind of going into too much detail about the kind of racial capitalist account, or perhaps even more orthodox Marxist accounts, right, which would posit that police exist to protect private property, essentially, right, in a very kind of reductive way. But then you get the kind of racial capitalism account, which goes a bit further, which might say, that policing emerges to protect colonial property, but also might be enmeshed with practices of slavery as well. But yeah, could you say a bit about how your discussion talks about property, but slightly departs from that way of talking about property?
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's definitely more to do in like putting this into conversation with those discourses than I'm doing in the book. What the thing that I wanted to do in the book is think about exactly that. So the idea of police as we talked about the police as a thin blue line. So like one of the ways in which we mobilize that idea is thinking about police as the kind of thin blue line that protects property, and thinking about how that is something which again, like I think it comes in too late to the story and gives us the wrong idea about what property itself is. Like slightly polemically, end the chapters with the argument that property is police, but everything is police. So, okay, so how do we get there? So basically, the idea is thinking about Locke's theory of property. I think a lot of the discourse around critiques of colonial property regimes and stuff like that orbit around Locke in an interesting way, and in a way that maybe is limiting. So even when we're kind of critiquing the kind of ideas that come through the Lockean justification for the colonial project, we're accepting quite a lot. So, for example, I think we might accept the idea that property is a regime, which is a matter of like the institution of rights over land in the first place, and that is instituted firstly through theft, to take Robert Nichols' like lovely sort of polemical like property as theft, including things like land clearances and obviously the genocide and settler colonialism and things like this. In order to justify those things, Locke appeals again to the idea of the state of nature. And Locke argues that not only is it our God-given right to ensure that the land doesn't kind of collapse into the state of nature, which would mean that it would be wasted, but we're required by God to make sure that doesn't happen, right? So effectively, we are required to annihilate the state of nature by transforming land into property. And Locke's theory is that, you transform land into property through labor. It's a labor theory of property. And there's lots of good criticisms of this. The way that that justification is mobilized is really important. But I'm drawing here on Sorrentino's work, and also Sorrentino with Tapji Garba, which I think is like actually really, really important article. Everyone should read that. It's the response to the Tuck and Wang argument that the colonialism is not a metaphor. I think it's called slavery is a metaphor. It is really important for me. Part of their argument is that relies on the labor theory of the slave, as they write. I'm kind of continuing their line of thought a little bit to suggest that this is invisibilizing the role of the slave and the consolidation of property. What we need to think about here is like slaves are positioned as property. They're thinking of slaves as chattel, and this is property under collective white control, essential to the coalescing of white community, to be part of civil society, which is also to be part of the regime of property, is to be distinct from the slave. This is to not necessarily own property, but to potentially own property. The slave is not in a position to ever potentially own property, according to the way in which the slave is figured. Locke, for example, argues that those in the state of slavery are, and this is a quote from Locke, not capable of any property, cannot in that state be considered as any part of civil society, the chief end whereof is the preservation of property. So what we have here is this tension between the necessary drive towards the annihilation of the state of nature, which Locke has told us is like a God-given requirement, and the necessary dependence of that drive on the labor of the slave. So then, you have the system in which protection of property is kind of strengthened in opposition to the arbitrary disorder of the state of nature, but the slave is made to embody that disordering threat. And so the slave is both subject to property rights, but also the object of exclusion against incursion on those rights. So they effectively embody this tension. Land can be rescued from the state of nature because it can be like turned into property through clearances, genocide, and labor. The slave, on the other hand, represents a state of nature that is both irredeemable and essential to this project. And then I start to kind of spell that out in terms of what that might mean through emancipation and this idea of thinking about emancipation. That I think I'm drawing on Taija McDougall's work to think about emancipation through this idea of selling slaves to the state and the way that selling of the slave to the state allows for control to be distributed. And then starting to think about how this works its way out in terms of thinking about the logics of the plantation and the continuation. So thinking about the way that Wynter's writing about this. So this is where I sort of revert to thinking about what happens after the like formal collapse of colonies and things like that. The way that we had subsidizing of those property regimes. So think about stuff like the way that we put national limits on workers, the way that we coalesce political movements around borders. So the way that unions rely on things like, the British worker, the American worker, these kind of categories, what they actually mean around arguments like the nationalization of services, arguments for things like universal basic income, which seem at first sight to be like relatively radical arguments, but always based on some form of citizenship. They're based on a border which facilitates the continuation of unequal exchange. So you still have this logic in which we are dependent upon those who are required to provide the resources for white accumulation and expropriation, but are also being simultaneously produced as exterior, as like forcibly outside, and kind of incapable of being properly part of that social world. And of course, like seen as like a perpetual threat to it, can always be mobilized as the kind of threat out the border of the polis, that kind of thing.
I think that comes through really nicely in the book, actually, this idea of the project of whiteness necessarily being impossible, or like the fulfillment of the project of whiteness being impossible, and the kind of paradoxes that entails, but also the violences that then produces, right? It's this kind of drive to annihilate something that it is nevertheless reliant upon, produces this kind of, this unstable, extremely violent situation. And I think that that's encapsulated really nicely in what you've written, because obviously there's some accounts of whiteness that portray it as being something that is completable, I suppose, or something that is rational and kind of logical and coherent, when actually you're pointing to its violent incoherence in a way.
Yeah, and part of that is simply a matter of tracing what I think Wynter is telling us about 1492, and also Fanon as well, right? Of course. giving us this idea of the sort of Manichaean infrastructure created through colonial modernity, the struggle to create a world through the breach of order and disorder, slave and master, colonizer and colonized, law and nature, and that like attempt to kind of create a breach. So for example, with law and nature, you've created this breach and then you're pushing nature outside and then attempting to suture a world. That's necessarily an incompletable project because nature is produced as a category within colonial modernity itself, right? And I think this is what's partly what I am thinking about, that idea of like whiteness as, like you say, a completable project, because what it does then is position what is the sin of whiteness on that story. It's the idea that you've got a partial universalization often, right? So it's like what happened is we took some categories from Europe and they are not the universal, they are partial. And then we universalized them as if they are the universal. And then there was this like othering that happened. And the other is then left with a choice, well, often, a forced choice, either to kind of be, to fight for inclusion within this universal or to like stake things out in a sort of plurality or pluriversal. I'm thinking about Mignolo and that kind of decolonial stuff. And yeah, I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it, because I think both of these things are created within colonial modernity itself. So the idea is that whiteness feeds on the nature that it pushes out, and actually that this idea of the state of nature existing outside the domain of the civil order, no, like the civil order is fractious and violent. And there's this quote from Anthony Farley, who actually I should have mentioned earlier, because Farley's work is like super important for this book as well. And Farley talks about the idea, I'm slightly misquoting because I can't remember the exact quote, but it's that this space of like civil order, what we think of civil order, or the space of reason, or the space of like freedom, is in fact the form of repressed desire and violence, repressed like anti-Black desire and violence. This is to sort of suggest that white worlding is not a coherent project in which you can have a sort of partial universal which works and is grounded in kind of reason and law and civility against an exceptionalized other. The argument is that no, this requires an endless attempt to suture the breach upon which it's grounded. And that attempt to suturing is what means that we end up with a world in the form of the police, right? So it's like the project is required to manage and make sense, like you say, of this tension between the drive to annihilate Blackness and maintain Blackness as the source of exploitable value, rights, privileges, the coherence of things like property, freedom, law. So any kind of like white world, lovely utopian sort of world of order and rule, which sounds horrible, is not possibly completable. And also, like, its very form is one of policing. This is why we end up like policing ourselves and each other, because the whole thing is grounded in this. There's implications to that, right? And I'm guessing we're sort of moving towards the end of the conversation, so it's a useful point to talk about that. So the implications of that politically, and this is not a very political book, I think.
What do you mean?
Well, like, I mean, I'm certainly like, there's no like policy like objective here.
No,
Like, this is not a
it's a very narrow version of the political, though.
no. Fine, all right. Well, it's not a book for like the Labour Party or the
No.
Democrats. Like, um, no, fine. Of course, it's like political in this sense. A good friend and colleague of both Milena and I's, Petero Kalulé, who I've written with a little bit before. One of the things that actually really sedimented our friendship was a phrase that they say a lot, which is that politics is police. And we wrote a thing a while ago about abolition and the politics of abolition and how that becomes recuperated under politics and effectively ends up recuperating police. This is not new. This is also, there's an absolutely like key piece of work by Jared Sexton called The Veil of Slavery, where he argues that, I don't want to completely mess up Sexton's argument, but basically, as I read it, the argument is that the attempt to root politics into the pragmatic, whether that becomes grounded in something like a project of like reparations or grounded in a project of land back, and these are the two things that Sexton is mainly concerned about, or whether this is grounded in a politics of like defunding the police, this will necessarily recuperate white supremacy. And I hope at least that the argument in the book is giving us some reason to see why that might be the case. The implications of this kind of impossible project of white worlding means that if it is in the impossible constitution of the world through which our categories of the political categories of like the human and property and freedom are constructed, then any project through which they could be restored is necessarily then a kind of reassurance of that world, which is to say it's policing, the attempted suture of that world. And this is where like thinking with petals is so important, I think. Petals' suggestion is to move away from the idea of abolition and towards either abolitionism or like the abolitionary or something like this, which suggests that the abolition is something, and this is how the book finishes, is abolitionism without ends. And where ends means, I guess, in the interminable or the incessant, the continuation, but also something that cannot be teleologically prescribed. So the endless suspension of the project of worlding itself. The idea that the world as horizon that could be closed has to be something that you can't just kind of move beyond that. It has to be endlessly suspended. And for Sexton, blackness is precisely the category that allows us to do that, which is why I think it's such an important piece of work, because it's, I guess, kind of circling back to where you began, Milena, in terms of thinking about sovereignty. This is precisely the way in which sovereignty can be neither moved beyond nor surpassed, but or against, but something else.
Great. That was really enlightening, I think, and really summed up some of the core arguments of the book at the end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. The book Everything is Police by Tia Trafford is available from University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for listening.